Hello, fellow late night lurkers. I'm OldDadGuy. I tell scary stories so you can question every sound in your house at 2 a.m. You're welcome. No turning back now. OldDadGuy here. We're doing something a little different with this episode. This one's going to be called Knocks on the Ridge, a Sasquatch story. What I'm going to do is break this one up into three parts. So this episode will be part one. I'll probably have part two on Wednesday, and then the thrilling conclusion the following Sunday. Definitely let me know what you think. Always happy to receive likes, comments, and shares. And obviously, definitely like and subscribe. Later on. The road up to Chestnut Ridge has a way of clearing its throat before you get there. The map says it's just a gradual grade into the highlands, a set of back roads stitched together by coal dust and hunting stories. But it felt like the woods leaned in as the miles clicked by, a crowd gathering for a performance that I had not rehearsed for. I wasn't running from anything. I told myself that out loud once or twice, the way you pat your pockets to be sure your keys are actually in there. My plan was simple: camp 3 nights, hike the old gas line cuts by day, fish a cold little stream I'd read about online, and spend the evenings sitting by a low fire, pretending I was the kind of person who enjoys cold fingers. Then set a small plate of creamers and sugar beside it. You headed up the ridge? She asked, casual, like asking if I wanted fries. For a few days, I said, just looking to stretch the legs and get lost a little bit. You don't gotta try too hard for that, she said. Out past the gas cuts, your phone's a paperweight. We had some hikers last fall spend a night out because they missed a turn. They told the sheriff the trees looked like they were all pointing the wrong direction. She didn't say it like a warning. It sounded like weather. I smiled into the steam. I'll keep the trees' opinions in mind. You camping alone? Yep. She lifted a shoulder. Well, you'll either love the quiet or you'll hear it talking. The pie is good either way, apple or cherry. Both, I said. I mean, one then the other. For science. That earned me the ghost of a smirk. She slid the menu toward me and pointed with her pencil. Hot roast beef's decent. Fried bologna if you hate your heart. I'll take the roast beef and a side of life choices. When she left, I watched the street. A pickup rolled by with 3 orange-capped heads bobbing in the cab, the bed stacked with firewood. A dog that belonged to everybody lay on the sidewalk and performed the world's slowest stretch. Above the diner door, a paper notice flapped. Fall Festival Parade Route. No parking Saturday. It seemed like the kind of place that put up signs for things it did every year anyway, the way people tell stories they know by heart. The food arrived and did the work. The gravy was heavy but honest, the kind that makes your shoulders sag in a good way. The coffee had the bite I wanted. I asked for the check and the waitress added it up with a pad and pencil, old school. Any last tips? I asked. She didn't blink. Don't camp right off the old mining roads. They funnel the wind, and if you hear knocking at night, it's just the wood talking to temperature. Good to know, I said. I put down cash plus a little extra because she had put up with my jokes and delivered something like advice without sounding like my mother. Outside, I topped off gas, bought a couple of chemical hand warmers that claimed to keep you toasty for 10 hours. So, 2.5 realistically. and pointed the truck uphill. The pavement narrowed and the guardrails got shy. Branches reached across like old neighbors leaning on a fence. It was early afternoon and late fall, and the light felt expensive. My campsite wasn't a formal site so much as a rectangle of level earth at the fold of two ridges, where a decommissioned gas line had been reclaimed by tall grass and 1,000 stubborn saplings. I had found it on a forum full of people who refer to their gear by nicknames, and who can argue for 5 pages about the ethics of dehydrating chili. There was a small fire ring, a log that had given up on being a tree and committed to being a bench, and enough flat ground for my tent. The stream was a rumor I could hear if I stood still long enough. I shut off the engine and let the quiet move in. You don't notice how much the truck hums until it stops. The woods weren't actually silent, of course. There was wind high in the branches, a scold of a jay somewhere above me, and a dry whisper of leaves dragging over each other. It felt like walking into a library where everyone is reading a book that I can't see. Tent first, I staked it down like the forecast called for stubborn breezes. Then I walked the area without the pack, making a circle big enough to feel like a plan. It's a habit from years of camping alone. Learn the immediate neighborhood before you start acting like you own it. I found 2 old beer cans, rusted to lace, a half-buried length of orange flapping tape that had been bitten by a mower sometime in the last decade, and the kind of boot prints that happen when a person stops to look at something, then steps again. Hard to tell how old. The ground here takes impressions the way a couch takes embarrassed nap wrinkles. It remembers the shape longer than it should. I said, "Okay," out loud, and it sounded like a man talking to his dog, even though I didn't have a dog. The air had that copper coin coolness. I could taste rain that might show up tomorrow or might be a rumor the wind spread. I gathered kindling from the high, dry spots and hunted for longer limbs we could call logs if we were to be polite. The fall damp in the highlands is a professional. You have to outwork it. By the time I had a low flame coaxed into something steadier, the sun had started tilting. My phone showed a last sliver of reception that blinked out like a wink. I didn't mind. I like a good digital detox as much as the next middle-aged guy who pretends he doesn't sleep with his phone on his nightstand. I brewed a camp coffee that tasted like apologies and sat on the dead log. The first odd thing was not odd enough to tell anybody about. It was just that feeling of a presence landing in the corner of your awareness, the same way you realize someone has stepped into a room behind you because the air seems to rearrange itself. I looked up and watched the tree line. No movement. A few leaves let go and helicoptered down. Something creaked, and then the creak became a groan as the wood flexed against wood. Temperature, I thought. Trees talking. The waitress's voice chimed in approvingly in my head, like my conscience had taken a second job. I ate a simple dinner of choices that had survived the drive. Cheese, crackers, a summer sausage that was better than it had any right to be, apple slices that made me miss orchards. I set the small pot on the coals and warmed water for cocoa, because I'm a simple person who enjoys childish luxuries. The steam carried up and made a ghost of my face. I told myself I'd turn in early and be up before dawn to put boot prints on a map nobody would ever see. When the dark fully arrived, it arrived all at once. Other places in the world have long dusks where the light steps down politely. Here, the day goes behind a hill and the night rushes in like an audience, finding their seats after intermission. The stars came through in patches. I watched my small circle of firelight and tried not to make the shape of every shadow into a person with bad intentions. The second odd thing was a smell. Not exactly a stink, nothing rotten, but a musky density that moved in and then moved on, like walking past a stranger who wears too much cologne. Or Axe body spray. You guys remember that? That stuff was horrible. If you wear it, I'm sorry. Anywho, it made the back of my mouth water the way a strong spice does. Not unpleasant, just stronger than the background forest. Bear, I thought. Or a deer, too used to campgrounds. Or the guy who invented bug spray. I turned that away with a shrug and put another small log on, the kind of size you can split with a stern look. The sparks lifted off and died a foot above the flame, like disappointed fireworks. The cold found my ankles. Beyond the firelight, the trees made a palisade. I tried a little humor aloud to keep myself human. If anyone's out there, I only brought enough cocoa for one. It didn't echo, which I took as a courtesy. Bedtime in the woods is a negotiation. You tell your brain that zipper noise is just fabric and that swish outside the tent is a leaf and not the end of your career or life. I crawled into the bag and listened to the nylon crinkle under my shoulders. The ground had just enough give to suggest it might meet me halfway by morning. My headlamp on its lowest setting painted a tiny circle on the ceiling mesh, then off, and the dark sealed in. I must have been 2/3 asleep when I heard it. A soft, spaced knock. Not close, not far. It sounded like two pieces of wood tapped together with more patience than force. Tap, tap, tap. Somewhere down the ravine, I told myself, a widowmaker on a limb setting. Trees talking to temperature. The waitress's voice again. I put that sound away in the cabinet where civilized people keep explanations for things the primitive parts of us would rather run from. Then a second set of knocks answered from uphill. Fewer taps. Quicker. As if something, didn't see the point of patience. Tap, tap. Okay, I said quietly to my own skeleton. We're not doing this. I shifted inside the bag and the sleeping pad squeaked a little, and suddenly I was furious with it for being so loud. Silence sat for a long stretch, the kind of long that makes you check your watch to be sure that time hasn't become decorative. I let my breathing ride the wave and then flatten. Once, something brushed the fallen leaves near the tent. Light, like a small animal testing if I had snacks. My brain offered me the image of a raccoon with a headlamp and tiny lockpicks. I smiled into the dark because it was that or hold my breath. When sleep finally unpacked its suitcase, it did so grudgingly. I dreamed work dreams. Emails I couldn't answer because someone had changed all the vowels, and woke to a gray tint in the tent fabric. The dream got out through a tear in the morning. The world outside the zipper was cold enough to borrow your vocabulary. My breath came out as honest smoke. The fire was a memory buried under ash that took coaxing to remember who it was. I made coffee that somehow tasted worse than last night's, but had more authority, then walked to the edge of the encampment, mug in hand. The day had that paused quality after a first frost, when Everything feels like it's waiting for someone to hit play. Down by the bend where the old road dipped, I found prints. I'm no tracker, but I know what boots look like and what hooves look like. These weren't either. They were depressions in the leaf litter that had kept their shape against a light wind. Larger than my hand spread wide. Not crisp like a plaster cast, but deliberate. The spacing made me imagine a stride longer than mine by a clean margin. The lefts and rights weren't two rails in a perfect line. They cut on the slope just right, as if whoever left them had hips that flexed wider than we do. I crouched and put my mug down and set my hand near one. The leaves pressed and rose back like breath. You can convince yourself of almost anything in the woods. I am a trustworthy liar to myself when necessary. I told the part of me that wanted a story that this was nothing. Then I stood and followed the depressions far enough to feel foolish, and turned back before I got that other feeling. The one like when you realize a conversation has been happening and you've only just stepped into it. I spent the day hiking that gas line cut. It rose and fell like a sleeping animal's back, the grass high enough to brush my hips. The sky was a bruised blue that promised weather without specifying it. I passed through pockets of air that smelled like iron, like rain, like something's fur. Once, something big moved across the slope, 30 yards ahead. The grass parted, then swayed shut like lips. Deer, I said to nobody. Big, swaggering deer. I reached the ridge crest and ate lunch on a rock that had warmed just enough. The view surprised me. Hills shouldered up against each other, a second, darker line beyond them like an echo. I thought about the waitress and her don't camp by the old roads advice and realized I had taken it almost without thinking. Wisdom sneaks in if you let it. On the way back to camp, the wind shifted and the woods reset like a deck of cards snapped against a table. I caught the smell again, thicker this time, not rotting, not sweet, not exactly animal, musky like a wet cedar chest. It faded quickly as it came. The afternoon thinned. A crow announced some grievance and then didn't follow up. The stream at the bottom of the ravine showed itself as sound first, then silver water shouldering around rocks that had been there before anyone who could name them. Back in camp, I raised the fire earlier. The cold had decided on me. I cooked in a pan as thin as a joke, listening to fat complain in small pops. The light went out of the trees the way a candle dims at the very end. A last brave glow, then surrender. I tried a little radio I'd brought, the kind with an antenna that doubles as a bedtime story for lightning. It caught only static in a low voice that might have been a preacher or might have been a traffic report from 50 miles away. It faded when I turned my wrist and didn't come back no matter how I bribed it. I ate. I cleaned the pan with a handful of grass and snow that wasn't supposed to exist yet. The coals banked to a deep red. I pulled my hat down and leaned back against the log, thinking nothing worth writing down, just the kind of good emptiness that daylight rarely allows. The third odd thing didn't announce itself at all. It simply became true. I realized, as if a curtain pulled, that there were footsteps beyond the ring of light. Not heavy like a thing trying to be known, heavy like a thing trying to be quiet. They weren't constant, 2 or 3 soft steps, then a pause long enough for me to convince myself I'd imagined it, then two more from another angle. And because I am a genius, I said out loud, "Okay, that's close enough." My voice was higher than usual, like a teenager's after a growth spurt. If I was auditioning for Brave Guy Who Camps Alone, I would not get the part. Silence retook the stage, fire ticking, the small sound of heat tearing moisture free of wood. Then, from down the ravine again, the faintest tap tap, more rhythmic tonight. Answered from upslope, tap tap tap. "I'm not a drum circle," I said, "because if you can't laugh, you'll start bargaining, and I had nothing to trade. Also, apologies if my cocoa offer offended the neighborhood." This time, a different sound arrived. Something like a low exhale. Not human, not overtly animal, but a pushing of air that carried a chest behind it. It came from the darkness to my left, the side I had convinced myself was safe because it was the side I was not looking at. I kept my eyes on the fire. People will tell you that staring into the night lets your pupils adjust and you can see more. That's true. People will also tell you that if you don't look at a thing, it can't be there. That's also true in a smaller, stupider way. "Hi," I said quietly, as if I was greeting a neighbor whose name I couldn't remember. "I'm only here for a couple nights," I added, because old habits are strong. "Please don't mess with my cooler. It's a rental." From the left, a step. From behind, two steps at once. Closer. Leaves moving under weight the way a crowd shifts when a famous person walks through wearing a hat. For a heartbeat, I wondered if it was a person trying to scare me. But there's a cadence humans have, the heel to toe of a biped who learned carpet first. This wasn't that. It was softer and larger at the same time, like the earth was being convinced to make room, not stomped into it. I set my palms open on my knees. The fire threw a little heat against my shins. Something flicked a small pebble from the darkness and it landed a foot from my boot. Not thrown hard, placed, if such a thing can be done from 15 yards away. "Point taken," I said. "Territory acknowledged." I gave a tiny laugh because part of my brain insisted that a raccoon had just participated in a union negotiation. Then the shape blocked a slice of the stars. Only a fraction, a shadow of a shoulder, maybe, and then was gone again between the trunks. No eyes, no face, no detail, just absence moving with intention. My heart did the thing hearts do when they remember their original job was to run from tigers. I told it we'd discuss a raise later. The knocks came again, one set farther down slope now, and an answer from nearer than I liked. The air tasted like damp fur again, like rain in a wool coat. I let the fire settle and fed it enough to keep the circle intact, but not so much that I'd be seen from the next county. Eventually, the leaves stopped talking. The silence had that filled up feeling again, like a room after a long argument when no one wants to be the first to speak. I put the lid on the pot. I made sure my headlamp sat where my hand could find it with my eyes closed. I zipped the tent slow to keep the teeth from announcing me, and lay down with a stiffness that felt earned. There are sounds that forests make that your brain files under normal within an hour. Twigs snap, rustle, small things gallop. And then there are sounds that live alone on a shelf. At some point between midnight and all right, let's not pretend we know the time, a single heavy footfall landed just outside the tent wall. Not a stomp, testing, as if someone had set down a backpack full of wet sand. I didn't breathe for 5 seconds. That took a week. The footfall didn't repeat. The leaf litter shifted, gentle. Something large inhaled, and then, like a held thought, released, moved away. I think I slept after that because I woke with my jaw sore from clenching and a line of drool making a cold signature on my sleeve. Morning came pale and patient. Outside, the frost had done lacework on the dead leaves, 1,000 small windows on nothing. I stepped out into it, boots crunching. Around the tent, nothing but the scuff marks I'd made. Beyond the edge of camp, a track I had not noticed in last night's jitter. A compression path between two trees. Not a game trail, too straight for that, but a corridor, used often enough that the ground had learned the idea of it. I followed it to where the old gas cut bent, and then to the ridge's shallow saddle where it dipped. There, on the far side, the leaves showed a story I could almost read. Not hoof, not boot. A pattern too large and too disciplined for deer, too purposeful to be a trick of wind. "You're not alone," I said, and the cold made my words look true. Coffee, fire, plans. I packed a day kit and told myself I'd hike the saddle and find the stream crossing, and maybe, if I got lucky, see a hawk take a roll and call that my moment. I checked my map even though it only showed the broad strokes and folded it the way people have for 100 years, an origami of confidence. As I shouldered the pack, a crow cut low and scolded me specifically. I saluted it with a half a granola bar. "Watch the sight, would you?" It called again like a landlord. I put the bar on the log for payment and started up the trail that wasn't a trail. Behind me, as I moved into the trees, I heard two soft knocks from somewhere in the saddle. An answer came from farther down the ridge, like a friend assuring another that yes, the guy had left camp now, and he was headed your way. My humor showed up late and said very quietly, "Okay, that's not ominous at all." I walked anyway, because running would have been rude, and because curiosity is a motor I can't turn off. The ridge stretched its long spine ahead. Somewhere beyond the next rise, water sang over stones, and something else, older than my ideas about it, watched my step into its country. Morning along the ridge has a way of pretending it's on your side. There's sunlight, sure, pale and a little unsure of itself, in the kind of clean air that makes you think that maybe you could run a marathon if there was an aid station every quarter mile and someone to carry you halfway. But the forest here, it has depth, layers of sound and shadow you can't quite separate. Even after a good night's sleep, which in my case meant 5 hours in a tent punctuated by suspicious knocks, there's this feeling that the day is just the polite front before something less polite shows up. I followed that corridor of compressed leaves I'd found earlier, moving slow enough to notice the details. Saplings bent in ways wind alone doesn't manage. A large limb wedged high in a fork like it had been placed there. Every 20 or 30 feet, something off. A rock turned over, a patch of earth scraped clear. I kept telling myself it was all deer or black bear sign. But deer don't move limbs into forks, and bears don't seem the type to landscape. The trail dipped into a shallow ravine where frost still held its ground. A stream about the width of my boot cut through, and the mud at the edge gave up a story. There were deer tracks, sure, but next to them, longer impressions, rounded at the heel, tapering toward the front, wide enough that my own foot looked like it needed to work out more. The stride was huge, and there were only two, left, right, and then straight up the other side of the ravine. I crouched there longer than I should have, listening to the water trip over stones. At one point, I swore I heard a faint splash downstream, but by the time I turned my head, it was just ripples. Back up the ridge, I followed the prints until they bled into harder ground. From there, I aimed for the gas line cut I'd planned to hike. It's a long swath of cleared space that rolls up and down with the land, lined by young trees and brush thick enough to hide anything with a good sense to crouch. You can see far in front of you, which I thought I liked, until I realized that meant I could also be seen from just as far away. The first hour was all crunch of leaves and my own breathing. A hawk traced lazy spirals overhead. Twice I stopped to check the map, which was about as useful as a motivational poster at this point. Then the wind shifted, and there it was again, that musk. Stronger now, a mix of wet soil and animal hide. My first thought was still bear, but bears aren't famous for keeping pace with hikers at a polite distance. I told myself, out loud, it's just the breeze playing tricks. My voice sounded like a guy trying to convince a date that the horror movie they're watching is not that bad, while gripping the armrest. Around midday, I found an abandoned hunting blind, half collapsed into itself, tucked against the edge of the cut. I climbed up just enough to sit, eat, and give my knees a break. From up there, the ridge looked endless, wave after wave of wooded hills. If you've never been in country like this, it's hard to explain how quickly you lose track of where you are. Every slope looks like the last one. Every stand of oak could be its twin 2 miles away. I was halfway through a peanut butter sandwich when I noticed the brush part about 60 yards out. Not violently, not like something charging, but just a subtle sway, one side, then the other, like a person walking behind a line of hedges. I kept still. A minute later, it swayed again, farther to the right this time. Deer, I whispered to myself, because apparently my brain thinks labeling things out loud makes them safer. But then the movement stopped. The woods went still in that way they do when something has everyone's attention. Even the wind seemed to take a step back. I waited. 5 minutes, 10, nothing. Finally, I climbed down, packed up, and kept moving. It was late afternoon by the time I reached the section where the gas line cut dipped between the two ridges. The shadows got long and cold, and the air felt watched. That's the best I can say. Like the space behind me had weight. That night, back at camp, the wind died down to almost nothing. The fire burned steady. I was halfway through my first mug of cocoa when I heard it. Footsteps again. Not crashing, not even deliberate stalking, just circling. A few steps, then a pause, always just beyond where the firelight gave up. I tried talking again, mostly to keep my nerves in check. Okay, if this is about the cocoa, I'll brew another pot. No answer, but the steps stopped. I thought maybe that was the end of it, until something tapped the side of my tent later that night. Once, then again, from a different angle. Not enough to collapse the fabric, just enough to make sure I was awake. Something in the dark, something exhaled, low and steady, and then the footsteps receded into the trees. I didn't sleep for a long time after that. By the third day, I had reached that point in a solo trip where your own company starts to feel like an odd neighbor you didn't know you had. I'd catch myself saying things out loud. Well, that's interesting. Or, let's not do that again. And realize there was no one to answer but the wind. My coffee water boiled slower. My tent zipper sounded louder. And the forest seemed to be taking notes. The night before hadn't been restful. The tent taps had started at some point well after midnight and spaced themselves out just enough to keep me on edge. I heard the exhale again, too, that slow push of air that felt aware of me. I laid there for what felt like an hour afterward, counting my own breaths and trying not to match them to some imagined rhythm outside. By morning, the air had that sharp, clean bite that promises weather, the kind where you can smell the moisture still somewhere over the next ridge, on its way, but not in a hurry. I'd planned to hike east toward a section of the ridge that dropped into a network of old logging roads. The waitress at the diner had mentioned it in passing, saying the cuts there were quieter than they should be. I'd assumed that was a small town code for no tourists bother going that way. The trail was barely that, more of a deer path through laurel and oak. The sun made early promises, but the canopy broke them, giving me dappled light and more shadow than not. Somewhere ahead, a woodpecker was doing its best impression of bad plumbing. 2 hours in, I came across a small clearing I hadn't expected. It had that look, knee-high grass in the middle, ringed by trees where their lower limbs are strangely bare, like something had cleared them out. The ground was lumpy in places too, with soft mounds like buried stumps. And right there, dead center in the grass, was a structure. Not a building, not a lean-to, but a tangle of branches and saplings bent into each other, forming a rough teepee shape about 8 feet high. The wood wasn't cut, no saw marks, but snapped and twisted. Some places still had leaves clinging to them, even though they'd been uprooted. I walked a slow circle around it. No tarp, no rope, no human trash. I'd seen enough backwoods hunting blinds to know this wasn't one. And if it was a kid's fort, they were the kind of kids you didn't want to meet in the woods after dark. The smell was there again, musk and wet soil, thick enough I could taste it. My first thought was bear den, but there was no bedding inside, just more crisscrossed branches. and the opening faced downhill, not the sun. I squatted to get a better look, one hand on my knee, the other holding my walking stick like it might double as a conversation starter. That's when the sound came, a soft thud from the trees uphill. Not like a falling branch, more like a deliberate step. I turned my head slow. At first, I thought it was just shadow stacking itself in the wrong way. The trees there were spaced enough that I could see the rise of the ridge, and in the middle of it, between two trunks, stood something tall, broad, still. I don't mean a big guy in camo tall. I mean taller than the doorframe of my house. Shoulders like two barrels side by side. Arms that hung lower than they should, even for the height. The sunlight didn't help much. It came from behind the figure, giving me more silhouette than detail. But the outline was all wrong for human. Too much mass around the upper body, tapering down to legs that were set wider apart than any person standing still. We looked at each other, or at least I looked. I couldn't see its eyes, but I knew they were on me. That awareness was a physical thing, like heat from a fire you can't see. I froze. My body didn't consult me about this. It just decided moving was a terrible idea. Then, in one slow step, it shifted to its left, crossing the space between the two trees without any sway in the upper body. The stride was smooth, almost like a glide, and silent. It didn't duck under branches, didn't step over anything obvious. It just moved through, and then it was gone behind a thick trunk. I stayed crouched there for another 30 seconds, heart working overtime. Then I straightened slowly, keeping my stick in hand like a talisman. Bear, I said aloud, because that's what you do when your brain doesn't have a better drawer to put the file in. But I've seen bears. They don't stand like that. They don't move like that. And they don't make you feel like you've just been inspected and filed under tolerated for now. I backed away from the branch structure, slow at first, then a little faster once I realized I'd been holding my breath. The rest of the hike, I kept catching movement in my peripheral vision. A sway here, a dark line between trees there. Every time I turned my head, nothing was there, or nothing I could prove. By late afternoon, I decided to head back to camp early. The weather smell was stronger and the wind was starting to fold in from the west. As I descended toward my campsite, a sound cracked through the stillness, a rock hitting the ground. Not tumbling, not rolling, thrown. It landed maybe 20 feet ahead of me, bounced once and settled in the leaves, fist-sized, heavy enough to leave a little crater in the soft soil. I stopped, looked uphill. No one there. No rustle of retreat. Okay, I said, my voice higher than I liked. You win. The rest of the walk was a head on a swivel affair. That night, as I got the fire going, the footsteps came again, circling wider this time, almost lazy. The smell drifted in and out with the breeze. At one point, I thought about calling out, trying to, I don't know, negotiate? But the words stuck. I just kept tending the fire, keeping the flames high enough to make me feel like less of a target. Later, lying in my bag, I heard something big move past the tent. No pause this time, just a steady, ground eating stride. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just being watched, I was being followed. My son is now at that age where he's curious about the female body. I guess I'll have to hide it somewhere else now. Meh. Oh, dad guy. You thought you were alone, didn't you? But they've been watching the whole time. Like, subscribe, and maybe they'll let you sleep tonight.